For our next presentation, we will be staying with the topic of decision-making, but this time in relation to gambling behavior. I would like to welcome Annika Lindberg, psychologist, researcher and trustee at UK problem gambling charity Gordon Moody to the stage. She is here to tell us more about the nature of gambling addiction and perhaps also about how to deal with this as a responsible operator. Thank you for coming all the way to Madrid.
Thank
Annika.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Hi, everyone. I've been here since this morning, and I got the impression a lot of you guys know each other a bit. I don't expect any of you to know me. So I thought I'll just introduce myself a little bit. My background is I'm a psychologist. I qualified in 2004, and after that I actually spent a few years in Las Vegas doing studies and treating gambling addicts. So that's kind of how I got into this. After that I went to England, and right on time, this was 2008, we started the first National Health Service. We were a very small team and actually very few patients. That service has now become extremely big and inundated with referrals. I left a couple of years on and have ever since been working mainly independently. I've been running homeless groups for problem gamblers, and also I've done a lot of private work. So one thing I would say is that I've seen the full kind of span of gambling addiction, from those who are gambling in bookmakers with little penny slots and stuff, till those who are considering themselves to be high rollers. So really grateful to be here today. One of the things that really excited me about coming is the idea of sharing the insights that we get from working with problem gamblers and being able to kind of bridge that into hopefully then prevention and early detection. I can say, as somebody who have treated them for a long time, that unfortunately when it gets to a certain point, addicted gamblers are extremely difficult to treat. They really don't have good control, and we're going to talk a little bit about the symptoms today that are relevant for the difficulties involved. So we're going to start discussing some of the symptoms. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to go into every single symptom, but I have chosen those that I feel would be more interesting for you guys and the ones who are relevant for prevention. We're going to talk about behavioral profiling, a little bit similar to what our previous speaker, Professor Kim, the product Mindway is based on some of those, although he goes more into the proper deep science with brain scans and so on. And finally, I'm going to make some brief recommendations for prevention. So the first symptom I've chosen is that of tolerance. Now, tolerance is perhaps something you all are familiar with. If you think about it in terms of substance misuse, it's often a little bit more straightforward. So you can think about, say, somebody who's addicted to alcohol might be wanting and needing, frankly, more and more alcohol in order to achieve the same desired effects. Now, when it comes to gambling, of course, we don't have just one type of gambler. We have many different types of gamblers. We have those that gamble because they want to achieve a buzz, and we have those who gamble because they want to reduce difficult feelings. So basically, in gambling, you're looking more at an emotional shift that the person is trying to achieve. And that could be in either direction, either to reduce a low or to increase the buzz. So when a person who's addicted to gambling develops tolerance, what's going to happen is that they need more and more intensification of the gambling. So that can often be reflected in increased stakes, definitely an increase in risk-taking behaviors. So people might have initially been quite responsible in the way they had their boundaries around the gambling, and then suddenly those limitations are out the window. You often see a diversification in terms of what the person gambles on. They might have started out, for example, being particularly interested in sports betting, and then just doing football betting, for example, and then suddenly they are sitting up doing all-nighters, looking at Australian dog races and that sort of thing. So the whole spread of the gambling is something we often see as well. I put here increased sloppiness. What I meant by that really is the chaotic gambling, and this is something when I forgot to mention, actually, I do expert ratings for Mindway, which is a bit relevant to this because what we do then is basically trying to perfect the algorithms from kind of a human intelligence side. And what we see then is this incredibly chaotic pattern forming. So you can very much see kind of graph style when somebody is gambling quite responsibly and adhering to limits, and when somebody, for example, is beginning to increase in tolerance, they gamble more and more and more as time goes by. Loss of control. This is perhaps the core of any addiction and a very, very big problem. And actually, I would argue, it sounds straightforward, but it is actually quite hard to understand. Even gambling addicts themselves tend to stigmatize themselves. They can say, I've lost control, but they also simultaneously judge themselves for not being able to apply willpower. So I drew this wonderful diagram with my new friend AI online to illustrate just the kind of gradients of control. So some people, you're going to find they lose control very gradually. They can be people who have gambled kind of responsibly and within their limits for many years. But they might have a big win, or they might start losing, or something else might happen in their life that affects them emotionally, and all of a sudden, the control is gradually slipping, okay? Now, these would be really good times to intervene from a prevention point of view. If that kind of person was picked up as in, hey, they're developing a little bit of a negative pattern here, chances are you could stop that person in their track. You could probably put in some limits or some breaks, or somebody could have a chat with that person, offering them a little bit of a kind of advice, and they might actually be able to revert back and continue to control their gambling very well. Unfortunately, those that I concern myself with are those that are kind of orange to red. Now, that group of people are extremely tricky, and I sometimes even compare them to, I use the kind of analogy of a peanut allergy, which sounds really extreme, but for some of them, actually the loss of control is that bad. So the idea that a person with peanut allergy, if exposed to peanuts, they are not going to be able to control their reactions. They're going to have a bad reaction, sometimes a deadly reaction. Same, unfortunately, is true for the kind of extreme of the red there, the very out-of-control gamblers. They are to the point where actually they cannot be in contact with gambling. And I'm afraid to say that is for life. The control doesn't come back to them. Losing control is going to be reflected in the external behavior of chasing. Yeah. So sure, most of you would know what chasing is, but if you don't, it's the idea that if the gambler wins, they keep gambling because they get a little excited and maybe a bit greedy and they want to win even more. Or if they're losing, they go back to gamble more because they want to recuperate their losses. Okay, so as you can imagine, if you've lost control and you're chasing, you're gonna be stuck in a very, very vicious spiral, because effectively, whether you do win or you lose, you're gonna keep going, and the net then will always be a loss. I think it's important to identify that there are many, many different types of gamblers, but perhaps the biggest two blocks we see, and this is also reflected when I rate the data for Mindway, is that we have the binge gamblers who perhaps don't gamble all the time, and they are the kind of people who come into treatment and say, hey, I don't have a problem, you know, I was able to go for a month without gambling. But when they touch gambling, it's very evident that they don't control what they're doing. So then they might lose tons and tons and tons of money. That kind of gambler as well, to make it more complicated, tends to be particularly competitive and are often interested in slightly different games. Then you have the more kind of regular, often quite compulsive gamblers that may gamble for very, very tiny amounts, but you can see that they have also lost control in the fact that they simply can't stay away from it. Now, the loss of control interferes massively with our ability to restrict gambling, for the simple reason that whatever we roll out in terms of self-regulation, you know, people prompting them to set their own limits and so on, you have to then consider the fact that this is a person who doesn't have that self-control, right? So they have lost control, and yet a lot of those measures are there for them, and they need to use them themselves. They need to basically opt in for a limitation, and most of them actually aren't going to do that. So that's just a little food for thought there. Inner conflict, this is also a very interesting yet extremely confusing symptom of gambling addiction. So as you can see on my little drawing there, this is the idea that the gambler simultaneously wants to quit, and this is of course provided they have come to some level insight. So they might feel that, yes, I have lost control, I should quit, and yet the other part of them is really, really invested in continuing to gamble. And some of the reason for this is what I've put here. I will just keep going until I win enough to stop. This is probably the most common statement I get from addicted gamblers, who basically view their gambling through the lens of financial deficit. So their idea is that I'm not really addicted, I'm just on minus right now, so I need to keep going and keep gambling more so that I can get back to even, and then I'm going to stop. Completely, of course, missing the point of their own loss of control. So you can see how tricky this gets, right? So you've got two symptoms where the person, they have lost control, yet they want to think they have control, and they're in conflict of whether they even should quit or whether they should continue. Yeah. So we're getting on to the behavioral profiling here, and this is mainly, I've already touched on a lot of the basics of this, but this is the idea that whatever goes on inside of us has an external manifestation. And of course, in online gambling, this would be relatively straightforward in the sense that you can gather a lot of data, you can gather demographics, you can gather plots and graphs and see over time how this kind of person is engaging with the gambling. Far more difficult when it comes to more land-based gambling, of course. But the idea is that an addicted gambler will leave a trail. It's going to be predictable. People like me, but I would argue you don't actually have to be a fully trained psychologist or an expert to be able to view patterns on a set of data, to be able to see that this is a person who is about to develop problems. The key, as far as I'm concerned, and this is my view, of course, is to use the kind of data that we collect as treatment practitioners, the kind of, we see the gamblers face to face, we have tons and tons, thousands of hours of conversation with them, we know how they feel, we know how they operate, etc. And actually what excites me is the idea of putting that knowledge onto AI and that kind of thing that can detect these people en masse, because obviously that is something that we unfortunately can't do. We can't reach that many people as when we're working in treatment. So just to kind of get an understanding of the kind of variables that you guys would want to look out for. Now, I'll start by sharing what we shouldn't fixate on too much. So, for instance, you might look at a static data set, which is almost always going to be pretty useless, actually. What I mean by that is, for example, seeing that X person gambled for £5,000 doesn't give us anything. It could mean something for somebody, could mean nothing for somebody else who has lots of money. Yeah. What we want to look at is the more kind of temporal dynamic data pattern. So if you can see how one person has progressed in their gambling engagement, that's far more valuable. Likewise, time spent is a common misunderstanding. People think, oh, such and such spent 12-hour shifts in there. Now, that obviously, from a kind of judgment point of view, you could say, shouldn't they have something better to do? But when we're looking for problems, it doesn't always indicate a problem. So the assessment of a problem is far more holistic than that, and we really have to look at the full amount of data in order to be able to detect whether somebody is headed in a bad direction. So when it comes to the symptoms I mentioned earlier, if we look at something like inner conflict, for example. Now, how that would come out on data sets is often limits that have been reversed. Could be a person who for example, calls up the casino, whatever it is, and says, I want to be barred, but then calls up the following week and says, actually, I'd quite like to reverse my bar again. Now, this is a pretty clear indicator that that person is exhibiting problems. Tolerance is probably one of the easier things to spot, in the sense that if you looked at that on data sets, you can really, really see how the intensification is happening. So that one I really kind of favor when it comes to detecting problem gambling. Chasing and chaotic deposits and withdrawal patterns are also very easy to spot. You can see when somebody has started using, for example, they might have used one card to begin with, suddenly they're using tons and tons of different cards, or they might be canceling their withdrawals that they were intending to make, and so on. So there's quite a lot of data to go by. This, sorry, Gambleware in England for hanging them out like this, but this was I feel, particularly strange advertising they had a couple of years ago. So what happened is they would put this one, I believe, on, I don't know if it was online, but they would put it on like slot machines and so on, and it would flag up like this when the person was gambling. And the idea, of course, was that they were going to react to it, see that when the funds stop, you stop. And actually, researchers from, I think it was Warwick University in England, were able to conclude that it had absolutely no bearing on gambling behavior whatsoever. So if you look at that in the context of what I've spoken to earlier today about the loss of control and so on, you can really begin to understand that this type of intervention is not going to be all that powerful for somebody, because if that comes by the time you've already lost control, they won't even notice it. Yeah. So if we kind of summarize the different interventions that could lead to more responsible gambling and harm reduction, we have what I believe a lot of you are familiar with already: limits, breaks. You might be able to, which I know the Mindware software are working with as well, the idea of prompting players that are headed in a bad direction from quite early on, making them aware that this is not looking promising, that you're about to develop a problem. And the key, of course, and I can't emphasize this enough, is to do that early on. By the time they are into the red area of the loss of control, really they need to be kind of, in my view anyway, on a lifetime ban, because nothing that you guys do or anybody does is going to have any bearing on their gambling behavior otherwise. I also mentioned earlier that I feel strongly that the subjective loss of control that the gambler experiences is so severe that it has to be considered when we regulate. And of course, I'm not here to give you a lesson on regulation or what you should and shouldn't be doing. But what I can say is that, and also actually I heard a couple of the talks this morning, particularly the one talking about fines and the kind of consequences really that the industry is facing when they allow addicted gamblers to keep gambling and so on. And I think with that in mind, it is in everybody's interest to understand a little bit better how the problem gambler works and how they work differently from somebody who is able to continue to enjoy gambling. Yeah, and the key here really is not to ban gambling for the masses, absolutely not, but it is to be able to kind of weed out those that we think are highly likely to develop a severe problem and stop those who are perhaps slightly problematic in terms of how they present, and be able to kind of set them off on a better track for responsible gambling. My view, and because this is not an area where I have worked, I'm not in regulation, I work in treatment, as I've told you, but from what I can see myself, I think one of the most promising ways forward is going to be AI and early gambling detection. And of course, in order to get those algorithms to work properly, you also need some level of consultation with treatment providers, such as myself. Because Otherwise, what we will miss out on is the diversity of the gamblers. There's so many different ones. We can't even begin to talk about it here today. But there's a complete subset of gamblers, and they have vastly different pathways into the gambling. But at the point where they are addicted, there's a set number of diagnostic symptoms that they all fulfill. So to be able to use the algorithms, perfect them from human intelligence, and then, of course, be able to launch them en masse so that we can detect the patterns early on. A big challenge is, of course, the more land-based gambling, where getting that data together is going to be a very different case from getting them from the online, where it's readily available. That was it from my... I cannot believe I finished a little bit early. I can tell you that has never happened before. So if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to answer them straight away.
What do we know now when it's too early now? We definitely have one or two good questions here. So, Annika, very, very interesting. So, first question we have here, can we have your view on gambling advertising restrictions? Do you believe that over-restriction would help? Or would be counterproductive, if you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I was in the session this morning where I must confess, I learned a lot in those sessions because I have not personally thought so much about the fact that when you regulate very hard, of course, you're pushing a lot of people into black market gambling, which is equally problematic. There's no denying that. Do I think that advertising restriction is productive or counterproductive? I really think that depends, again, on who is at target. Obviously, the type of gamblers I meet with, I can tell you 100% is counterproductive. There's, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's counterproductive. But that is also referring to often the very targeted marketing that they are getting. So you might be, I'll give you a common example, for example, is people who they might be getting text messages to their phone, come back for lucky spins. That kind of advertising is extremely destructive for people who already are trying to abstain. So I think the generalization that comes from advertising could be pretty destructive for those who have problems, again, if that answers the question.
Great. Very good. I think we actually have time for a second question. What is your view, Annika, on the use and possible effectiveness of AI in interaction intervention? You mentioned it a few times, but maybe as
I think that is extremely promising for so many reasons, but it's particularly to do with the reach. So I don't know any other way that you could get what effectively is decades of research, decades of treatment knowledge, all of what we know about addictive gamblers, and put it onto something, in this situation a robot or a software that basically can go to work and detect these patterns from a much, much earlier stage, so that you are able to divert those gamblers that nor you nor anybody else is going to benefit from having them, I don't think, as customers, because they are going to come to harm. And unfortunately, there will be a lot of consequences, I believe, for many of the operators as well, if they are continuing to come to harm. So absolutely, I'm very pro-AI interventions for that.
Great. Well, Annika, thank you very much for joining us here.
Thank you.